Okay. Shall we get started? It's my pleasure to introduce the next session. Also my pleasure to say that immediately after Alan's plenary, both James and Alan will be joining me for a round table to explore some of the themes that have emerged in the morning plenary and Alan's upcoming plenary. So, Alan Mackenzie and I have known each other for a good 20 years now. His career has taken him from Japan to Thailand to India to Pakistan, and now he's director of Transform ELT, which leads educational change projects literally worldwide. I've seen him speak on many occasions, and have no doubt this will be equally good. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, you can tell by the title, this is not a small picture presentation, this is a big picture presentation. So we are going to look at what the major trends are in language education, how governments and institutions, individuals are trying to catch up with those trends, and where the gaps are in keeping up, how we can bridge them, perhaps. There are 10 gaps in my presentation. They're not the same as the ones listed in the program. So if you're looking at the program and checking off the list, I've changed them because I found out some that I thought were more important and needed to be reprioritized, which is something that we should all do. And when we're planning things is look at it again, change it, make sure that it fits the current situation. If you want a copy of this presentation, you can take a picture of the QR code and download it directly. If you miss the QR code, then you're very slow because it comes up twice, once at the beginning of the presentation and once at the end. So there's plenty of opportunity to get a copy of it. You don't need to email me. I'm sick to death of writing emails to hundreds of conference participants asking for the PowerPoint slides. So please help yourself if you want it. Sorry?
One thing.
Okay. More chances to download the PowerPoint. Please feel free to read ahead. During the presentation, I am going to be asking you, this is an interactive plenary, I'm going to be asking you some questions. You don't need to do it in pairs or groups if you don't want to, but I will be asking you some questions and getting you to think about stuff as I go along. Are we done? Okay, great. As Tom said, I'm one of the directors of Transform ELT. The other two are Sarah Mount, who was here at the beginning of this conference, but had to go back home yesterday, and Alan Pulverness. We are involved in helping individuals, institutions, and education systems transform themselves, change themselves, fulfill their development goals. If you have an idea for where you want to be, but don't know how to do it, we're the people you get in touch with to talk about your plans. We've been around for 2 years only. We set ourselves up in 2017, and during that time, we've worked in 18 different countries worldwide. Here's a map of where we have worked. The outlier over there is Cuba. Our biggest project was in Ethiopia last year, where we had 11 trainers working to train 450 Ethiopian school inspectors in coaching and mentoring skills, which was talked about previously. Chris Farrell did that presentation on coaching. We were training them to do that across the whole school system in Ethiopia, not just for English language teachers. We're also doing a testing project in Sri Lanka where we're measuring the English language ability of teachers within the secondary school system there. And we're developing textbooks in Cambodia for grades 8 to 12. So we really are working on a global level. And it's through doing these projects, here's a list of some of the other projects we're involved in, it's through doing these projects that we've noticed trends happening within the industry on a global level. But it's not just our experience that says so. The British Council has had a couple of publications over the last few years. The first one was English Next by David Graddle. That was published in 2006. And he predicted a number of trends happening within the ELT industry over the 50 years from then, and over the past 10, 15 years that that publication has been out, everything that he has said has come to pass, and it is going to keep going that way in the future. The British Council also commissioned a study last year of what will English look like in 2025. And they found exactly the same things that we found and that David Gradle has found in the past. So there's a strong evidence base for the main trends that are coming up in English language teaching. And they are, first of all, that English has become a basic skill in a lot of countries. Now, most recently, I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. I was talking to their deputy education minister, and he said, English is not a subject anymore. It's a basic requirement. You need English and other skills, but English is becoming a basic requirement for working at a European level, at a global level. To participate in the global economy is usually the line that governments use for why students need English. These codes at the side are to remind me which country I need to talk about and give examples about. So the second one is G for Georgia, is another one. Small country, but making big changes in its education system. They're integrating English language development into their vocational education system for people like bricklayers, tilers, as well as the people who work in the hotel industry, bartenders, catering staff, to make sure that they have skills that they can use to work with people who speak other languages but need English as a lingua franca within those industries. That means they also need employability skills. What are employability skills? What do you understand by employability skills? Can anybody give me an example? No ideas? Teamworking is one, yeah. Negotiating. Being polite. Being able to resolve disputes. Being able to work in a group. Being able to research stuff by yourself, to be able to be and act independently, as well as understanding what your role is, what your responsibilities are, and when you are going beyond your responsibilities, how can you reach out to somebody else to help you with a difficult situation? Basically, being able to function in the workplace. Now, that's a big problem in a country like India, where that stuff isn't taught at school. The school system is based on rote memorization. It's not based on life skills. So those life skills are having to be integrated a lot more at secondary level to enable those children to be able to be employed somewhere in the future. And English is a major part of that, being able to do that in your own language as well as to do it in English. In India, English is a lingua franca because every single state and every part of a state has a different language. So they use English and Hindi as the main lingua francas for communication within the country. In Georgia, again, they are integrating those life skills into the curriculum at a practical level, along with English, and I've just rewritten the curriculum for them for the tourism sector to ensure that the practical employability skills and English are integrated in their curriculum. This is also important because when Georgia managed to get access to the Schengen zone, a quarter of its population left the country to go and work overseas. Seriously, a quarter of the population left the country. They moved to other European countries to get jobs where they could get an income that they could send back to Georgia to enable their families to survive and thrive, because the salaries in Georgia are pitifully low. So a tiler, you might think, why does a tiler need English? Well, if he's going to go to the UK to tile my bathroom floor at £30 an hour, he's going to earn an awful lot more than he does in Georgia, where he's only going to get about £1 an hour. That's the motivation for learning a language and learning it as part of a trade and a set of skills. The younger, the better, is something that, the population mobility there. Transnational education is another part of that, going overseas to study. You're doing it here. I was in the presentation yesterday where we were talking about attracting international students to the Czech Republic as an income generator. Delivering courses in English in this university is going to start happening within the next year, 2, 3, something like that. Within the next couple of years, that's going to happen. And that's happening all over the world, not just Europe. Japan has a program where the 30 universities within the country are setting up international programs so that you can study a subject in English in Japan. Refugees, we all know about the refugee issue across the whole of Europe, but that's not only happening here, that's happening in African countries, across borders. It's happening in Asian countries with the Burmese refugees going to Bangladesh. There's mobility of people all over the planet, and it's only increasing. That mobility means they need to be able to communicate with the people that they're meeting across those borders, and that often requires English. The age at which we are trying to get our learners to be able to communicate in English is decreasing rapidly. A lot of governments still believe the fallacy that the younger you start teaching English, the better it is. The younger the better. This is Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, they just did a recent study for whether it was feasible to introduce English at the primary level. And the current president of IATEFL, Hari Kuchakucha, is the person who did that study. He turned around to the government and said, your teachers speak French, they don't speak English. Your students haven't experienced any English until secondary level. There's no infrastructure there. There's no learning within your education system. This is a really bad idea to do in your education system. And the government, the minister, turned around and thanked him for being honest about the situation in their country. Because they could spend a huge amount of money putting primary English into the classroom there, but the teachers wouldn't know how to do it. They would struggle with it. It would make life very difficult for them in an already difficult context. And I think that's something that we need to think about. If you believe that teaching students at the age of 4 is a good idea, then think about what your teachers need to know, how they're going to do it, and whether it's worth it or not. An hour or 2 of English per week at that age is not going to improve their English language ability. You might as well wait until they're a bit older and have better memories, longer attention spans, and around about the age of 9, 10, introduce it at upper primary rather than lower primary. It's not a good idea to introduce it too early. Content and language are being integrated a lot more. We just heard about the English medium programs at university. That's one way that content and language are being integrated in different places. But across the whole of Europe, there are CLIL programs emerging in different parts of the continent. Places where a subject at a secondary school is being taught wholly or partly in English, and that is to help the English language development of the students, they say. It depends on where you go as to what that looks like. In Georgia, again, in the vocational sector, they're making that a part of the general curriculum, that you're learning the content of of the subject that you're teaching as you're learning the language. We just ran a project in France where they're trying to introduce CLIL into secondary schools outside of what are called the European sections within secondary schools. And that is an experiment that is going to be ongoing over the next 5 or 6 years. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. Content language integration, we have seen started maybe about 10, 15 years ago and is happening across different countries. Do you have it in the Czech Republic? Do you have any CLIL classes happening here, yeah? In high school? Which subjects do they actually have? Is it science, maths? Yeah? Okay, so quite a range. And is that only in special schools, or is that... But does that only happen within your school as a special school, or is that a regular thing that happens around the country? Right. So it is, but that is acknowledging that it's a difficult thing to do. It's a really hard thing to do for the teachers, and it needs to be carefully planned and introduced. It can't just be mandated. You can't turn around and say every school in the country will have one class in maths in English. That won't work. Right. So, well, that's a major question with content-language integration. If you're teaching the subject in English, what language do you get them to sit the exam in? Should they be doing it in English or in their native language? If they're not learning it in their native language, why should they be sitting the exam in their native language? But there are lots of questions associated with that. The other one is technology integration. Of course, technology integration is happening all over the world, but it's happening at different speeds in different places. The different technology available in different places is different. You're quite lucky here by the looks of things. You have wonderful projectors and video cameras and Wi-Fi internet. That's not the same in a lot of countries. Ukraine, secondary schools. The secondary schools have projectors, interactive whiteboards, Wi-Fi. The universities don't. One of the universities I was at is just about to get their second projector, and they're very proud of it. But that's because of the funding level at universities is different. In the secondary schools, the parents will contribute to the funding of the new technology. But in the university sector, it's up to local government, and they don't have the money, so they don't get the technology. Which is a bit odd. When they don't have Wi-Fi in university, and everybody's sitting there with their mobile phones without a data connection, it's really hard work. We had a project in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire where you might think, technology, they must be quite backward. Well, we had a project where we made a toolkit for school English clubs, and we reproduced it on SD cards and handed it out to people in schools, and we thought that was the best way to do it. But we also made an online version of it. We made 25 SD cards, but when we put it on the website, we had 150 discrete hits to the website. So all of these teachers are accessing the website on their mobile phone and using the ideas from that, hopefully, in their English clubs. So they're wired up, even in places like Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. How technology is being used in different places is different, and we can't assume that just because we're using technology in a specific way, it can be used in the same way in other contexts. And that's because we're dealing with very complex systems. Education systems, the systems within which we're trying to change things require a lot of help, require a lot of understanding. This is actually our theory of change for how we deal with education systems. I'm not going to talk through it. You can go to our website and see an explanation of it there. The point being that you need to understand within an education system where are the main points within which you need to press the buttons to make things happen. Where is the information flow between the different parts of the system? It's not that simple. It's not as simple as doing a training course and magically everything will change. That doesn't happen because most training courses don't end up in any kind of real change. One of the reasons things are changing is basic economics. This is a graph of how our societies change over time. At the beginning, we were all agricultural societies. We all were farmers. And then the Industrial Revolution started happening. Industry grew. As it grew, we needed services to back up that industry and to help the agriculture move about within our countries. And as we go over time, service sector within our countries increases, so that at the moment you have a situation where the US service sector, for example, is 80% of the US economy. The agricultural part of the economy is less than 1%, and the less than 20% is industrial. Services are really important in the modern world. By contrast, if you take China, for example, China's about there on the map. It works out to about 50% services and 50% a blend of industry and agriculture. Where do you think the Czech Republic is? Yeah, somewhere in between. It's about 2.5% agriculture, 59% services, and 37% industry. Over time, the industrial sector is going to decrease, the agricultural sector is going to decrease, and the service sector is going to expand. It's just what happens when economies move forward over time, unless something dramatic happens and we suddenly change our way of life at some point in the future. Now, that's important because services use language. Services are about talking to people, and talking to people from different countries. There's a whole sector called the Business Product Outsourcing sector, BPO, which means that if a part of a business can be done anywhere else in the world cheaper, it will be. And that isn't just your call centers. If I call up Virgin Media in the UK, I get a call center in the Philippines. If I am a British Gas client and I call them up to ask for an appointment, I'm in a call center in Bangalore in India. The call centers in the Philippines last year generated $23 billion for their economy and had 1 million workers working within them. And there's a similar story in a number of other countries that have these business product outsourcing centers. But it's not just helplines and call centers. Kerala state in India has a contract with the state of California where Indian teachers teach American kids about maths. They tutor them in maths on a one-to-one basis. It's a bizarre situation, but it's true. There are also a number of e-tutors around the world these days who are setting themselves up as English tutors. How many of you teach online? Do you one-to-one? Yeah? It's good business? Yeah? If you want to know about it, ask your man here, because it's the Airbnb or the Uber of English language teaching. That's where most of the clients are going to go, not the face-to-face language schools. So if you own a language school now, you should be thinking about what your online provision is going to be in the future, because that's the way the world is headed. The top 10 countries for business product outsourcing: India, China, Malaysia are the top 3. Now, China wasn't on this list 5 years ago. China was way down the list, and it's surged quite dramatically forward, mostly due to the increasing English language ability of people in China. They're mastering English at higher levels, better, faster, cheaper. Brazil is up there too. Indonesia and Thailand, bizarrely. Now, Thailand, if you've ever heard a Thai speaker speaking English, you'll know that there are quite a lot of pronunciation difficulties for Thai speakers. But despite that, they're gaining ground in the call center market. They're number 6 in business product outsourcing. The Philippines, I told you 23 billion and 1 million people. That's only number 7. So think about how many people and how much money the other countries are generating. South America's coming up too, with Mexico and Chile. Who do you think's number 10? It's one of your neighbors. No. 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 Poland. Poland's number 10 in business product outsourcing. A lot of that is to do with the quality of English language speakers that you get in Poland, the high quality of education that they receive, and the fact that the call centers pay an awful lot more than most other industries do. I was recently in Ukraine, and their pedagogical universities, the graduates of pedagogical universities, are mostly looking at Ukrainian call centers as future employers rather than going into English language teaching, because in English language teaching, they will earn $283 a month. And in a call center, they can earn 5 times that. So that's what they're doing with the English language skills that they're developing. They're not going to be using their teaching skills much unless it's in training other people within the call center. So, the whole point of talking about all of this is to get to the point where I'm telling you about this first gap that we've noticed is the difference between what employers want and what education systems produce. Now, you might not think of your students as educational products, but that's exactly what they are. They're products of the education system. And if those products, those people, don't have the skills that employers need, they're not going to get jobs. In Georgia, they've got a fantastic education system. Everybody thinks going to university is what you need to do. Getting a degree is what you need to do. So it produces wonderful intellectuals who can discuss the finities of economic theory. The problem is that they don't have the skills that industry wants to be able, the practical skills that they need to be able to do a job. What is now happening is that people with university degrees are going back into the vocational colleges to do a practical administration diploma so that they can actually get a job, because nobody's employing them with just their university degree. We need to think about this a lot, especially in higher education. What are we doing? What kind of people are we producing? What can they do at the end of it? This is a quote from one of the pedagogical universities I was in a couple of weeks ago. The linguistics is fantastic. You have philologists here in the Czech Republic? Well, I didn't realize that philology is a historical linguistics. It's about the evolution of language and how it changes over time. But how many philologists does one country need? And you don't need to be a philologist to be an English teacher. I've never studied philology. I didn't even know what it was until I looked it up in the dictionary a couple of weeks ago. What the Ukraine has decided is that they need English teachers, and they need English teachers that know how to teach. And so they've taken their basic methodology course of 150 hours of classroom time, they've expanded it to 600 hours, mostly experiential, mostly based in schools, observing teachers, assistant teaching, and actually teaching in schools before they get to the end of their degree. What happened before was they had a very theory-based methodology course that talked about all the different types of methodology you can do. It was all very book-bound with a little bit of teaching practice at the end. That didn't prepare teachers to go into the classroom. This new course does. It is producing very highly experienced, very professional teachers who are ready to jump into the classroom on Monday morning as soon as they finish their degree. So this is how one education system is trying to plug that gap. There's a lot of focus on pragmatics, what we actually do with the language. It doesn't matter if you know how the language works. Knowing the rules is not going to get you a job. Knowing how to use the language is what's going to get you a job. So the pragmatic side of language, what you actually do with it, is what's important. There's some interesting work in the call centers. I'm terrible with call center people because I get really annoyed with them. You're nodding at the back. Do you shout at them too? Like, why are you wasting my time calling me? I'm in the middle of a meeting, stop it. I get angry with them. But then how can they need the skills to be able to defuse that situation to do what they want to do, which is their job, which is calling you and making you angry. But how do you stop people from getting angry? What does a computer, if you're producing a computer engineer, what kind of language do they actually need to do their job? Now, there's a few years ago, I was talking to a Thai researcher who was looking into the English that nurses need. What English does a nurse need to do their job? You'll think, oh, the drug names and the medical words and that. No, that's not what they need. They need to be able to say things like, are you okay? How are you feeling? It's that phatic communication, the bonding communication is what they really need to learn. That doesn't come from a drug packet. It doesn't come from knowing the medical words. It comes from the social language you need to be able to take care of someone. You can take whatever occupation you want and stick it in there. But similarly, a construction worker, do they really need to know the theory of construction and how to make a brick? Not really. They need to ask, where do I put this? Where does this go? How do I do this? Do you want me to do this first or that first? It's much more pragmatic language that they actually need to be able to do their jobs. And we have to think about what is not important to learn. Teachers are forever complaining that we've got so much to teach, that we've got so much in the curriculum, there's so much that we need to cover. Is there really, how much of that could you happily just forget and focus on the essential stuff? Because that's what the employers want. The employers want enough to get the job done. You don't need to know everything about the language. You just need to be able to use it for the purpose that we want you to use it for. Our second gap. What are you assessing? So we've got this understanding of what a person needs to be able to do in a particular job of work. But then we've got an exam. And it's what's on the exam that's important, isn't it? Because that's what you all need to get your students through. They want as high marks on the exam as possible. So the exam actually controls the curriculum. And that curriculum controls what materials you're using in your classroom. And those materials control what methodologies you're using. And that all needs support for the teacher to be able to use those materials and implement those methodologies to be able to meet the curriculum goals and hopefully help your students get as high scores as possible on the exams. But it's the exams that do a lot of the controlling within our education system. And if they are measuring the wrong thing, everything else has to come into alignment with it. And no matter how much you try and fight against that, it's not going to work because your students want to pass the exams. So, what should happen? You tell me about exams changing. What should happen? How? Why? Any agreements, disagreements? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. The exam tests, exams such as the one that we've identified as a problem, tests the ability to reproduce a certain amount or a certain kind of knowledge at that point in time under those conditions. Totally disaggregated from anything else except for the question in question. The person behind there was talking about a much more integrated, holistic, total ability to function in a fluid
And portfolios tend to be much more performance-based, not under pressure situations like exams usually are. There are a number of exam systems that are getting it right. In Germany, in Bavaria specifically, they have vocation-specific English exams. So if you're an engineer and you're learning English, and they all do, to quite a high level. I've been teaching the Bavarian engineers at Nile who come across for their summer school for the last 5 years, and they're an excellent group of generally young men with the occasional woman in between. But they are going to sit their own vocation-specific exams at a B2 level. So the tasks that they have in the exams are tasks that you would find in the workplace. Describe this machine part in English. They have a plan of a machine part and they have to talk about it in a pair. They have work-specific problems. An email about an accident in the workplace that they have to reply to and give more details about how they're going to deal with this situation. Very job-specific tasks. In Taiwan and Malaysia, the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, isn't only used in Europe. Taiwan and Malaysia both are using it and referencing their exam system to it and making their exam system more performance-based in an attempt to increase the level of English in those countries. I say they are doing it. They have been doing it for the last 5-10 years for Taiwan and the last 3-4 years for Malaysia. And that is having a big impact on the way that English is being taught in the classrooms in those countries. Tom, you were part of a project working on the Nepal exam systems. Would you like to tell us what you did there? And am I wrong in thinking that you helped people within that country develop their own test items? Yes, so yeah. Training local item writers how to write successful items and their work with items and how unique items. Yeah. Making a good exam is really hard work. It is not for the faint-hearted. I would not take on the job of writing an exam. I'd employ Tom to do it because he's much better at exam writing than I am. And he knows other people who are good at it as well. Any education system who is thinking of writing its own exams needs to develop the capacity within it to do it properly. Test your tests, because they need rigorous examination, do they not, Tom? Yes. But, as I said before, what employers are wanting is enough English to do the job. You don't need somebody who's working in a hotel in housekeeping to have a B2 level of English. Somebody in housekeeping needs A1 if they need it at all. If they're working in an international hotel, they probably need enough to be able to do very basic interactions with a guest because they're not going to meet them very often and they don't have to negotiate complex things with them. A waiter or a waitress in a bar or a restaurant might need an A2 level of English. They don't need to negotiate to a great extent, or if they do get to a situation where they do need to have a negotiation, they call the restaurant manager, who is more likely to have a B1 or a B2 level of English. And if they are having problems, then they'll call the assistant manager, who's more likely to have a B2 to C1 level of English. And it depends on your job as to what level of language you need to be able to do that job well. In Georgia, in the vocational education system, they're doing exactly that. They're pegging the abilities needed for each specific job to that job category and teaching people to that level, requiring a graduation level for reception staff of B1, for example, but for catering staff of A2. Going back to the slide, have you spotted the odd one out? What makes this not work? If you're engineering students, you would spot it immediately. Exams are driving it. That drives the curriculum. That drives the materials, then the methodologies, but there's something wrong over here. Teacher support's going the wrong way. That's often what happens in education systems. It's lack of teacher support that stops things from moving forward. Everything we've been talking about over the last few days, the coaching, the mentoring, the CPD system, the management side of things, disappears in practice in a lot of education systems. Teaching is a very lonely job. You're put into your classroom and told to get on with it. Hardly anybody ever comes into your class to see how you're getting on. Very few people ask you, how was your class today? Especially not in the state school sector. You nodding? Yeah, it's a lonely job. Well, it shouldn't be. Why are we left alone to do these things? It's the teacher support system that's at issue there. And we are doing really complex jobs. It's a difficult thing to do, so we should be supported in some way by the education system. But often, when an education system wants to change something, it tells us what to do and then gives us a bit of a sticking plaster solution to it. They just give us a Band-Aid. That often leads to having disaffected teachers. People who are, they're in the UK, there was so much change happening within the education system that teachers just stopped listening. Oh no, not another change initiative. Not going to bother. They just gave up without even listening to what the change was and what was going to happen. That led to a large number of programs that just don't work. Do you know how many change initiatives don't work? They have counted this. Not quite 99%, but it's up there, it's 80, generally 80 to 85% of most change initiatives just have no evidence that they ever happened or succeeded. Often it's because we're trying to change too much too fast. Who was it yesterday that said baby steps? I think it was Ola from Teddy, the Ed Bear. She was talking about taking baby steps with learners. And we said, yeah, you need baby steps with teachers too. Small, slow, incremental is much more effective than trying to change absolutely everything about what you do quickly. Often, the education system or the authority in charge is trying to do the wrong kind of change. It's trying to change something that teachers don't understand or don't want, that students don't understand or don't want because they have a different motive to the learners or the teachers. It's because they're often not taking into account the context, what is there already and how does that work, what happens between teachers, learners, materials, the other components of the education system, and what are the priorities of the people within that system. What do they think is more or less important? I think teachers who choose songs for their learners, for example, often go back to their childhood or their late teens. Tom's favorite is the Arctic Monkeys, of course. But the previous generation of teachers would often go to things like the Beatles. Kids these days are not engaging with the Beatles. They're more likely to be listening to rap, or in the UK, Korean pop. They're listening to other stuff. They're not listening to the Beatles. So why are we using that as teaching material other than it's got a grammar form in it that we need to teach? Let's look at other sources, more modern sources for our materials. The time frames are also important in change. Too fast, I said before. Very often, we're trying to create large changes within education systems over an extremely short period of time. That is not a good idea, and it's not likely to happen because change takes time. Teacher development takes time. It is not something that can be changed overnight by a one-shot, short teacher development course. That just does not happen. And I promise you, I had planned to say this before I attended your presentation yesterday, honestly. We were talking about this yesterday in, what's the name, sorry? Angelina's session. The scale is also something that's important. Rather than starting and trying to see if something will work on a small scale, like's happening with your school, one class, let's see what happens, and then we'll try and expand it later. Often, what the education system does is decide everybody's going to do this all at the same time. That's a nightmare scenario. You have so many people changing over a huge geography in a short period of time, and it generally doesn't work. So, how do we deal with this? Well, one thing is to acknowledge that teacher development is not training. As soon as we talk about changing what teachers do in a classroom, we start talking about training courses. Send them to a Nile online course. That'll cure them. Yeah, maybe. But as we saw from Tom's impact study, 75% of the teachers who took those classes tried something significant in their classes. The other 30% didn't do a great deal. So where's the impact there? How much of that training course are they using in their class? How much of that are they taking out? And generally, there have been studies that look at what do teachers get from training courses and how much do they use from them. It's usually about 5 to 10% that creates any decent impact in their classes. Not a lot. What does work better is ongoing. In this conference, we've grown an aversion to the term continuing professional development, but some form of ongoing, punctuated way of changing your teaching that is more effective than a big one-shot training course. Or a one-shot training course that has follow-up attached to it, that has a development process attached to it, that will lead to, on the ground, actual change within the classroom. That requires support in terms of time, people, things, and processes. So, if you're thinking about starting a change program in your institution or your education system, don't start thinking about the training course or the input. That's pretty much a given. But what are the processes that you want your teachers to engage in? What are the things that you want them to produce? The things that you want them to use? How much money have you got to be able to do this? What's the budget for this? Are they going to be compensated more? Are you going to be able to spend money on library resources or internet connections or whatever things you need to be able to make this happen? And who is going to do this stuff? Who are the mentors? Who are the coaches? What skills do they need to enable this process to move forward? There has to be some form of reward system built into it. It doesn't need to be financial. It doesn't need to be a pay increase. But as Dorothy said, sometimes we need to pay them more for what they're doing. We need to compensate them for the amount of time and effort they're putting into their work. At the same time, teachers generally aren't that motivated by money. They are motivated by doing a good job a lot of the time. And often, professional development is a good reward for developing professionally. So the more you develop, the more professional development you have access to. So if you've taken part in a change program and done a good job, and giving them the reward of coming to a conference, for example, or getting them to present what they've done at a conference, even better, get them to share that information with other teachers. Giving them a status that's different from the other teachers is useful. But that also requires changes in law an awful lot of the time. That can be difficult. That's why we need to have consultation. What rewards do you want for doing this? What would you like to have? How do you see this happening? Imposing a system from the outside without asking people What are you doing? How can we do it? How can we make this work? You're the ones that are going to have to make it work. Well, how are we going to do that? Use it as a group problem-solving activity and as part of a team-building activity. One of the big solutions to increasing quality in English language teaching is to bring in so-called native speakers. I started off my career in Japan. They had a program called the JET program, Japan English Teacher Program. Every year for the last 30 to 40 years, they've been bringing hundreds and hundreds of native speakers to Japan to work in secondary schools and primary schools across the country as the gaijin teacher, the native speaker teacher. Has that led to increases in Japanese English language? No. They have spent millions and millions of pounds. These guys get, about £2,000 to £3,000 a month each. Pounds a month each. And it hasn't made any significant difference to the education system or the attainment levels of Japanese students. The politicians don't care. They just keep shelling out the money for these very expensive people. And they are expensive. If you look at the average salary of a non-native speaker teacher compared to native speaker teachers in most countries, you will find that the native speakers get paid more than the non-native speaker English teachers do. These values for the non-native speakers come from the OECD statistics website. The native speakers is from TEFLinternational.com, which is one of the main recruiting bodies for native speaker English teachers. Yeah. The range of salaries that a native speaker can get as a native speaker, yes, it will be state and private sector. And the non-native speaker that's generally state sector. Yeah. It's quite marked in the Ukraine. It's because state sector salaries are so low. Another thing that those teachers are doing, teachers who are graduating from the teacher education programs, is going to work in China, because they can get $1,500 a month in China, which is a lot more than they can get as a state school teacher in the Ukraine. People mobility, again, they're moving to get work. Native speaker problems. They don't have a great deal of experience. Stick them on a CELTA for 4 weeks and then put them in a classroom. Compared to what I said was the 600 hours that the Ukrainian teachers are getting before they go into a classroom. That's a whole heap more experience. Native speakers generally have very little knowledge of language learning. The state of modern foreign languages in the UK is abysmal at the moment. We're learning less languages. We have very few hours of language learning in high school, and the attainment levels of high school students is at its lowest level, the lowest level it has been for quite a number of years. They don't know what learning a second language is like. They often have ulterior motives. They're not there to be an English teacher. They're not career English teachers. They want to travel. They want to have exotic food or experience new stuff, be musicians, be artists. There are very few English language teachers who choose to be English language teachers. They use it as a way of doing other stuff. They may not have had the best initial training. Of course, CELTAs and DELTAs are good initial training, but there are other certificates out there that aren't quite as stringent. We don't know. There's an unpredictable commitment there. We don't know how long they're going to stay in the job, how long they're going to be English teachers for. But the politicians tend not to care about that, because it's the easy solution. Bring in people from outside to solve our internal problem. Maybe they'd be best spending the money on dealing with the internal problem rather than paying it to foreigners who are going to take that money out of the country rather than invest in the system. The European Union, ASEAN, India and Africa are all putting vast amounts of money into language development and English language development. Our native English speaker countries, both the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, are putting a lot less money into helping people learn a second language or third language. We're not as well prepared for the future as organizations like the European Union, ASEAN, India, or Africa. The people in native English-speaking countries tend to be more monocultural, and we're becoming a lot more protectionist. Our Donald Trumps, Brexit, all of that kind of stuff is leading to us closing the doors on other cultures rather than being open to intercultural dialogues. The result might be that people from the traditional native English-speaking countries are less skilled in international communication in the future. People from the EU, ASEAN, India are going to be better prepared for the workplace of the future. There's a huge difference in salaries of teachers. Again, this is state school teachers, and it's not just English teachers, but state school teachers around the world. Down here, we're looking at 10,000 for Lithuania, Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, about 20,000 US dollars a year. Does that sound about right? Yeah? These are OECD figures, they're not mine. If you go up here to somewhere like Norway, you'd have 40,000, and somewhere like Germany or Luxembourg, you could end up with 100,000 if you went overseas and became an English teacher in a state school system in Luxembourg. That's a massive gap between those different countries. That's a gap that needs to be closed, or people are going to migrate to get better jobs elsewhere. If you look at the gender of teachers in different schools, that's the primary schools at the top, the little diamonds are secondary schools, and the X's are tertiary sector. This is the percentage of women in those jobs. Every single country has more women in elementary school education. There are more men in secondary education, and men dominate in tertiary education. But look at the gaps there. The closest country, the country that has the smallest gap down the bottom, is Saudi Arabia, where they have separate school systems for girls and boys. Only girls can be taught by female teachers and only boys can be taught by male teachers. So if you do want to close the gender gap, maybe we can learn lessons from Saudi Arabia. I don't think so. Those gaps need to decrease. And so does the technology gap, the difference between the haves and the have-nots. I'm not going to go through that. The difference between the haves and the have-nots, the needs versus garnish, the fact that just because we've got do we really need the posh video cameras? Or is there something else we could be spending our money on? How much of that is just for show and not really what we need to be spending our money on? So working out the budget is really important, and what we're doing with it. The other thing is that in the future, we may all be out of jobs anyway, because these little buggies are coming in from Waverley Labs. You just stick them in your ear, and you get an automatic translation of whatever anybody's saying in whichever language you have. That's coming down the line. But I don't think that's going to be taking over anywhere soon. We're still going to have jobs over the next 5 to 10 years. But the universal translator is coming. Finally, the research gap. How do we know what works, and how do we know what to change to? If we're going to change our system, what are we changing to and why? That needs to be researched. What does effective project design mean? If we're going to change, who else has used that method, and what happened in that situation? What can we learn from other people who have used the same change methods that we want to? Tom presented his results for the Nile online courses, the impact survey that they did. That is a really important thing to do, measure the impact of whatever change we're implementing in our schools or our education systems. But understand what impact means. It's not just customer satisfaction. It's not just, did the teachers like it? Are the students happy? That's a very superficial level of impact. We need to know, what can they do? How well can they do it? And how are we measuring it? So, I'm going to stop there, because that's very quickly going through the 10 gaps. There are other slides on the presentation. If you've downloaded it already, have a look at it when you go home tonight, if that's what you do on a Saturday night. There's a good bit more information in there, but I'll leave you to unearth that for yourself. There are some suggestions there about what we can do on a bigger education system level. But I think I'll stop there, and we'll deal with any questions during the round table. Thank you.